And Michelle suggested that maybe we would start talking about the media and how this plays into everything. And then I said, Michelle, what do you think about Juneteenth instead? It's going to be leading up to it. And she said, perfect, let's do it. So, and I think we may have a parent that's going to join us at some point. She's also working, and so I'm not sure if she's going to be able to get away. I'll text her now. But Michelle Tyrene Johnson, most of us know her. She wrote for the Kansas City Star. She was on KCUR, our public radio. She is a playwright, and I've had the pleasure of seeing 2 of her plays. And she is just an artist, and she has a gift in being able to bring voice to uncomfortable conversations. And so she is going to today talk with us a bit about Juneteenth and its relevance to today. And without further ado, Michelle Tyrene Johnson, take it away.
Well, Deidre, with that introduction, I feel like I should go slink off someplace and get some real accomplishments, because you made me seem bigger and better than I am. So anyway,
and I forgot to tell people, even though you're not in Kansas City, thank goodness for Zoom. See, we still get to use you. When you moved away, I was like, oh no.
Exactly. So welcome everybody. Good afternoon. As Deidre just says, I'm a Kansas Citian, but I'm a Kansas Citian who now lives in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a talk show producer for the local NPR station's weekly talk show. But in addition to everything that Deidre said, I've been a newspaper reporter. I'm now in radio journalism. I'm a playwright. I've done diversity work. I'm a writer. I've been an attorney. I was an employment attorney for 8 years. And sometimes when people hear my background, they go, how are all those things connected? And how they are connected is actually what we're going to talk about right now. They're connected because regardless of what I do, whether I'm a writer or a journalist, a playwright, or an attorney, everything to me is about, but how do things connect? Like, what's the real behind the real? Like, what's the real deal? And we live in a society right now where it has never been easier to find out information and never been easier to have misinformation thrown at you at the same time. And so Juneteenth is an interesting holiday in that we all of us who have heard of it know just enough about it to think we know something bigger. Thanks, Mariah, for that. And we kind of all sort of generically go, it's connected to slavery and the end of slavery. So let me start off by saying the biggest disclaimer of all disclaimers. I am not a historian. I am not a history undergrad major. I do not have any degree in history. And like so many things, I had to look things up because I'm in my 50s and I grew up in KC, and I don't remember hearing about Juneteenth growing up. It certainly wasn't ever taught in any schooling I went to. Mariah, can we go to the next slide? And one of the things about Juneteenth is that it starts off with something that I hope most of us have heard of, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the end of slavery. So, you know, the government hasn't really changed that much, believe it or not, in hundreds of years. You know, you have decisions that are made by the powers that be, bills have to be signed, things have to become signed, and then they become official. Now, the big difference between the government of yesterday and the government of today is that the media is different. And think about it. How do any of us know about anything, right? Like, you either hear about it on the news, you hear about it through social media, or somebody who you know, who has watched the news or social media before you do, has told you. I mean, I joke, my best friend and I, for example, have this running joke that's not really funny, but a running joke about it's all about which one of us tells the other one first when a celebrity has died. Like, you know, it's you hear that someone's died, and then one of us rushes and texts the other one. Well, here's the thing. In the 1800s, there was no texting. There was no Twitter. So Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, but it went into effect January 1st, 1863. Start of the year, 1863. But if we go on to the next slide, Juneteenth ends up being about, well, actually, let's just take a little pause about Lincoln's views on slavery. So how many of us, kind of sort of raise your hand if you have heard the phrase over and over again, Lincoln freed the slaves, right?
It might be good to go off screen share for just a second, Mariah.
So how many of us have heard Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Okay. And so accompanied with,
I can't hear her.
Can you not hear me?
I wonder if it's something on your end, Michelle. I think that the mic seems to be working fine on my end. Look on the bottom of your screen. You might need to turn your volume up. Michelle Robinson, not Michelle Tyrene Johnson. Sorry, Michelle Tyrene Johnson. I think you're good.
Okay, I was about to say, I was like,
no, I mean, I think hers was muted at what, because I mean, all I could see was her lips moving and your lips moving. I couldn't hear nothing else. I mean, all I could see was lips moving. But I can hear you now, Miss Beautiful Michelle.
Okay, Miss Beautiful Michelle, whose name is spelled right. Michelle is properly spelled.
That's the only way to spell it.
But, you know, I was just making the point that part of the whole discussion about Juneteenth, and it may be a small point, but it is a point in that associated with all of us hearing that Lincoln freed the slaves, we think of him as, I mean, I think one of his nicknames is the Great Emancipator. And with that comes, you know, the value judgment of looking at him as someone who he hated slavery and he was standing up for the rights of Black people and African Americans. And if you do enough reading, actually, Lincoln was pretty indifferent to slavery. I mean, I'm not saying he supported it, but his whole thing is he just wanted to sort of preserve unity. Think about that for a minute. How often have we heard of that in recent years? Preserving unity. And preserving unity doesn't always mean you want good things for everybody. It just means you want peace. It just means the person saying it wants peace. So, you know, I sometimes wonder if that played a role in sort of the casualness in which things developed in terms of communication. So I think we can go back to the slide next, or the slideshow, because the crux of what we're talking about, thank you, Mariah, is the next slide, which is, what is Juneteenth? So Juneteenth is short for June 19th, and it marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and basically showed up and said, yo, you're free. Now, that's Michelle language. Obviously, the federal troops in 1865 didn't say yo, but that's when they showed up. But look at that date, June 19th, 1865. And when did I say that it became official? The Emancipation Proclamation? January 1st, 1863. So we are talking, I think, I can't remember the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, Mariah? And there you go, that's the one. So look at this year. So that's 1963, right? A whole calendar, 12 months. And then let's go to the next one, please. And then another year passes. Well, let's go back. And then another year passes. Another 12 months. Then we get to June. Oops, we're just moving a little bit. There we go. June 19th, 1865. So you see that? 12 months, then another 12 months, then the middle of month 6. Now, I don't know about you, but wouldn't you hate to get good news 2 years and 6 months later? Can you imagine if you got an email for a job you interviewed for in 2019? Oh, you got the job. What? I got that job 2.5 years ago? Or those of you who have kids, a lot of you are parents. Can you imagine not figuring out that you were a parent? I mean, I've known my share of people who didn't figure out that they were pregnant until very late into their pregnancy. That's one thing. But can you imagine somebody showing up at your door with a 2.5-year-old and being like, aha, you had a kid? Because 2.5 years is a long time. And when you really think about it in today's concept of time, you know, COVID notwithstanding, because I think COVID has messed up everybody's brains about time. Think about, you know, sort of like what I was saying about my best friend and I texting each other as soon as the celebrities died. We're not talking even weeks anymore before you find out that something has happened. Think about the last big national event, which was January 6th. Can we go back to the full screen? Because I would love to have people answer this one question. How long did it take for you, and just sort of randomly just unmute and just shout it out, how long did it take for you to find out that the January 6th insurrection happened in relation to when it happened?
5 minutes.
I still ain't even heard it.
But you know about it though. My point is, when did you know about it?
I just now knew about it.
Really?
Today, yeah. I've been going through a lot of surgeries and doctor's appointments. I was in a car accident last year, so
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Okay.
I've been focused on my rehabilitation.
Okay, well that makes sense. Some of the rest of you, with me, I was literally watching TV as it was unfolding before me. What about some of the rest of you? What other times?
Yeah, same as you as it was unfolding.
Okay. Anybody
Hi,
else?
Yeah, watching the vote count, the electoral college, and so it was instantaneous.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Now, is this about where Donald Trump redid the election, wanted to recount everything? Now, I did see that.
We're talking about the attack on the Capitol.
Oh no, yeah, I did see that.
See,
The white girl that
Michelle,
got shot.
I knew
The
you
white
had
girl that
to.
got shot. Yep, I seen it.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, my guess is there anybody who a whole week passed and you heard about before you heard about it? Is there anybody where there was a month passed before you heard about it? Right? Like, seriously, did it even take longer than 24 hours for anybody before you heard about it? Right? So think about something like that. And we can all probably, regardless of whether we're 20 or 75, can think back to things we've learned about in the last 20 years where we knew about it pretty instantaneously. Because what are some of the ways we know about news, right? We got our these cell phones, right? These cell phones, text alerts, texts from friends, emails, phone calls, and then let's not forget, and January 6th is a really good example because more people were atypically at home because of COVID, right? So a lot of us were working from home. So that 24-hour news cycle. So, you know, you're either watching CNN or MSNBC. you know, I'm going to assume that there is a Fox News person or two who was on this. You know, however you found out about it, you found out about it. And in the case of Juneteenth, though, you're not just talking about, let's think about this for a second. You're not just talking about finding out about news. You're talking about finding out about something that is as personal as you can get. Your freedom. So what are thoughts on that? You know, anybody, just jump out and think about, sit that with that for a second. What would it be like to just find out that you were free to go wherever you wanted and do what you wanted after a lifetime of being someone's property?
I'm going to weigh in on this because we've been tracing our ancestries and found out that we do have slavery in our family. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave to Austin King, the governor of Missouri, who helped abolish slavery in Missouri. Well, after they did all of that, he actually adopted his slave, which was my great-great-great-grandfather, and brought him into his home. And weirdly enough, he ended up having children with the governor's daughter.
Ooh.
Hence how I became here.
Juicy, girl, juicy.
So it's kind of weird for me because I'm biracial.
Mm-hmm.
So dealing with the racism was pretty bad because I was either too black for white people or too light for black people. So it's kind of weird, but it never affected me. Like, I didn't let it bother me. I knew who I was. I knew I was one of God's children and that I was beautiful.
And I'm sure that when, you know, and maybe I'm presuming, but when we start talking about slavery, whether we're talking slavery itself or the end of slavery, with your background, it's got to raise some interesting thoughts in your brain because you're from both sides of the lineage. You know?
Yeah, because see, like, my father is got 4 different Africans in him, Creole and Native American. My mother is Irish and German. So
yeah, exactly. Anybody else have any thoughts about just sort of trying to mentally place what it would be like to know not only that you're free, but that you've been free?
I'm wondering if I could frame it in contemporary times a little bit too, Michelle, you know, like we've done with some of the other issues, which is some folks, and the parent has confirmed she'll be on about 12:30 to join you on the second portion, Michelle, but we've talked a lot about like, how does all this history play out in contemporary times? And one of the things that has been said is that our prison system is contemporary slavery. And so, you know, think about a loved one that you think's getting out of prison, and he or she's told they're going to be released from prison, but you have to wait another 2.5 years for them to actually come home to you. That might be another way to think about the question Michelle asked.
Yeah, and Peter, just to make sure I understood, who's coming on at 12:30?
The parent that's going to lean in with you on the post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, all of us can relate to the weight, even if we don't want to think of it in terms of slavery. Like for I'm sure all of us are of the age where we've either been in the hospital or we have visited a loved one in the hospital. And we all know that there is usually a gap between when either you're ready to leave the hospital, but your doctor or doctors say otherwise, or when your loved one is ready to leave the hospital but hasn't gotten the release. And even then, that sometimes is just a matter of, at most, days, not they're in the hospital 2.5 years, or you're in the hospital 2.5 years past when you're supposed to supposed to be gone. But one of the interesting things about Juneteenth as a holiday is that it actually technically is about the people of Texas finding out that they were under the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Juneteenth has morphed into this holiday where it's sort of become this everybody found out 2.5 years later. And I was talking to a historian just last week who's a historian of African American and Africana history. And one of the points he makes is that depending on what state you lived in, your Emancipation Day was different. And so it's not uniformly and regularly, well, everybody found out on Juneteenth. No, it was the people in Texas who found out on Juneteenth, 1865. And it was a roving date that changed. He was saying how in Florida, they celebrate finding out about the end of slavery on May 20th, that's when the holiday is. So, but I think Juneteenth has become a symbol of Emancipation Day. So any thoughts about that? I mean, anybody who's surprised to hear that it only technically applies to Texas, but is something that we sort of all universally recognize. Anybody surprised by that? Come on, parents, I'm gonna start treating you like the kids and calling on folks.
I'm not surprised.
Yes. Anybody else not surprised?
Did you guys know that Missouri was one of the last states to free the slaves?
I knew it. Which then gets to the whole thing about history, right? Because when we start looking at 1865, now, I'm going to out my own age. I don't expect anybody else to do it. Because, when people talk about slavery, or especially people who don't want us to talk about slavery, it's as if it happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation only happened 101 years before I was born. I don't know about you, but that's not a whole long length of time.
Well, that only makes you like 40, right?
Right. Exactly. Yes. And I mean, it's funny because one of the few days in history that I can remember is that JFK was assassinated because he was assassinated a year and a day before I was born. And it's just not lost on me. So that means that he was assassinated just 100 years after the end of slavery. And just 100 years. And that's one of the reasons why I just think we can look at Juneteenth as nothing more than a old holiday. But the question we have to keep asking ourselves, and why we would teach it to our children, is, but what's it a holiday what is it that it represents? So for those of you who don't know much about Juneteenth, just, and if you want to put it in chat, that's fine. I'm kind of behind on chat. Here we go. But you can put it in chat or you can say it out loud. What is it that you think Juneteenth becoming more widely talked about? What is it you think that represents in our society right now?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? My brother actually had a nice little comment on what we were talking about in the Juneteenth, which I didn't know that after this, the freedom for Texas, or this whole, abominating slavery, that's when they decided to build jails, which would have been another form of locking us blacks up.
Adriana, do you have a comment? I tried to get you earlier. I could see you trying to talk and then you put yourself back on mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, Adrian.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think as a society, it sort of points out more awareness, acknowledgement, since Juneteenth is being more widely discussed. I feel like, well, I even have a coworker that said, I don't know what Juneteenth is. And, she was very empathetic and saddened by George Floyd's death. And, I guess a lot of people just kind of live in their own bubble and and I won't say won't care, but I guess if it doesn't affect them, then why would I worry about it, Whereas me, I've been raised up, I didn't learn about Juneteenth until probably late middle school or high school, because Kansas City had a Juneteenth celebration. And so, as a teenager, we would go down there for the concerts and stuff and, enjoy that. But that was sort of my first learning of what Juneteenth is. And of course, I have family members that are, history gurus. And so, they taught us and talked to us about all different types of things. But I think it's good, especially for corporations, to start, considering celebrating Juneteenth. Because honestly, it should be as big as July 4th, in my opinion.
So let me ask you guys this question.
Hold on.
Thank you for that, because that's kind of the, can you guys hear me okay? That's kind of the framework of how even a lot of Black people get to Juneteenth. They get to it as a celebration first. They hear that there's a, parade, a picnic. There are some cities where they have beauty pageants. In fact, Mariah, if we can get back to my slide, I think I have.
Yeah, before you do, Michelle, I think Mary Frances is trying to say something. Hi, Mary.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Were you trying to say something, Mary?
No, I think I had said something and I forgot to put myself back on mute. But I did post in the chat. Sorry,
Oh, okay.
I'll put myself back on mute. I had just answered the question she had asked. Sorry.
See, I'm gonna say something too, like how I knew nothing about Juneteenth. I grew up in a very small town, population probably 4,000. They absolutely did not teach us any Black history down there. The only time we learned Black history was in February. And it wasn't really a lot that they were teaching us. And even still to this day, I still think they do not teach Black history down in my hometown or a lot of the small towns, which isn't fair.
Yes, and Melissa, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think Juneteenth, again, is there anybody who can tell me that they study Juneteenth in school, grade school or high school? Could you?
I knew nothing. What our Black history was for us, we were taught about the Civil War. We were taught about the Emancipation Proclamation. We were taught about like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and, the advocates for us. But as far as like our real history goes, we were never taught that in my school.
Mm-hmm. And on a similar note, even though I don't want to get too far off into the bunny trail, put in the chat if you had heard about the Tulsa massacre before a couple of years ago or 5 years ago. Is there anybody who studied the Tulsa massacre in any of their education? I didn't. Anybody?
I had heard about it. I'd have to refresh. I can't recite what I learned about it, but I had heard about it. Did it have something to do with the Indians?
No.
Yeah. I had heard about it, and yeah,
Was that
I
the
have
Black
to read
Wall
up on it
Street?
to remember it.
What'd you say, Latrice?
Was that the Black Wall Street when they burned the whole town down?
Exactly. I was got to say, yeah, that's exactly right. And there are people who only know about it because it's been mentioned in popular media. I think did the Watchmen make reference to it? Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. I was in Tulsa not that long ago, and there you can't even really see a whole lot. There's not even a whole lot of remnant. There is an effort to try to rebuild and recreate some of the history that was lost, but it might be useful to tell a little bit more about what that really meant. I mean, there's a lot of commerce lost when that massacre happened.
And for those of you who don't know, and again, I am not a historian, so I only know a superficial amount, but it's worth Googling how there was this prosperous community of Black people, thriving business people, hardworking, and white folks burned it down, literally burned it down.
Yeah.
Like I won't say every single white person in Tulsa, but a mob of whites in Tulsa literally destroyed it. People died, businesses were destroyed because, oh my God, I mean, and that was 100 years ago. They're celebrating
The 100th
anniversary, 100-year anniversary
This year.
this month.
Yeah, they just had a.
KCPT has a great documentary on it. I really love that station when it comes to history. They show old pictures. They reference the banking system that they developed and how they purchased all the property as a whole, and half of the African Americans there were not even related to each other. So it's a great way to remember our history. So say that.
Exactly. Adriana, you were saying something?
Oh, I was just going to say 60 Minutes did a segment this past Sunday on it, and so they spoke with one of the descendants, like one of the descendants. I think his great grandfather or great great grandfather was a lawyer and was, had a firm on Black Wall Street, and they kind of go into a lot of details, and then kind of into how after all that had occurred, the business people couldn't file insurance claims because insurance wouldn't give them proceeds from their business being burnt down. So again, affecting wealth that they had, and they weren't able to rebuild it because they couldn't get any proceeds from the destruction. But if you can catch that, it's pretty good. And also talks about how hospitals wouldn't take any of those who were injured during the riot and massacre. It was only one hospital that would take them.
Oh wow.
It's very sad and interesting, and it's just eye-opening.
I think what Mariah typed in the chat about what's actually, oftentimes when the history is taught, it's also often from the angle of like glorifying white people in that conversation. And I know a few years ago, I took my daughter and my mother to the Brown versus the Board of Education museum. And I remember this conversation with the gentleman that was running the museum, that there was nothing that showed like the tension that took place during that integration. And we were talking about it, and it was a very whitewashed approach to talking about what really happened. Like you would just think it was just kumbaya and everybody just was happy when all those kids transferred into the other schools. And I'm like, yeah, there's no need to have the conversation with him because he doesn't understand, like he's not willing to go there.
Right. And I mean, and all of this is not unconnected. I mean, if there's anything I want you to get whenever you hear me talk, is that my whole thing is that things are connected in ways that we may not think they are, because we all get so busy in our lives that we take for granted information, and we don't go any deeper. And I'm guilty of this. Whatever I don't know much about, it's because I had not taken the time to learn much about it. Okay? Because the days when you had to get yourself to a library and check out a book to research something, that train left the station decades ago. You know, people have to decide what's important to them to know more about, and then they have to make the effort to go find out. As a playwright, I mean, when I'm writing a play, a good half of my time is spent literally researching as I'm writing. I am going back and forth between screens constantly, because even when I'm making up a story, I wanted to have a basis in something factual. And so when we talk about Juneteenth, what I'm going to challenge you all to do, and I know that there are some resources that Emily and Deidre and others have supplied about how to look up more about Juneteenth, and we'll have this, you know, maybe Emily can throw some links up into the chat session. But I just think it's important for us to unpack why Juneteenth is important. So there's two reasons why Juneteenth is important that I want us to really talk about. I don't want this to just be about me running my mouth and you guys sort of passively listening. I want you to listen, but I also want you to like engage with the bigger piece. So one of the things about Juneteenth is a thing called, and you know, Mariah, if we could get back to my PowerPoint, because I want us to go to the the very first. We can go past that. We can go past that. Oh, let's go back. Go back. See, there's a picture that I found from an old story about Juneteenth. And I mean, look at that. Like, that's a photo where people are in the joy position of Juneteenth, right? Like, because one of the things about Black people, if you know Black people, if you are Black, you know this, and if you know Black people, you know this. We can turn anything into a spot of joy and celebration. We make coming together the most powerful, beautiful thing there is. There are don't get me wrong, there are other cultures that do the same thing, but I've only been Black this lifetime. And it is a thing of beauty to see how people can celebrate it. Like I said, have beauty pageants, have food events, have music, but we're doing our next generations a disservice if we don't tell them the powerful reasons why what we're celebrating came about. You know, even when it's negative, they should know that. So then our next, oops, that's perfect. The next slide is this: post-traumatic slave syndrome. So first of all, we all probably have heard of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is all the ways that we're impacted by too much stress. So there's a doctor, a researcher who developed her theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And it's about the ways that we carry the trauma of slavery, particularly Black people. And I don't know if any of you all have seen that there's science that says that trauma is carried in our DNAs. So Jewish people, in their DNA system, Holocaust is literally in the DNA that gets passed on, in the sense that once you have been through trauma, it impacts you physically, and then it gets passed on to the children you bear. So if we can get to the next slide, Mariah, thank you, is how does post-traumatic slave syndrome manifest? So there's a lot of words here, and, you know, throwing a lot at you, but you know, you all can read this to yourself. But one of the ways that I think of post-traumatic slave syndrome is, first of all, it goes into all the things that have happened to Black people in America. So this, you know, when people go, well, slavery was so many years ago, that's old. But why do we act as if slavery doesn't impact every big event that happened after slavery? Like the Tulsa massacre. That was 100 years ago. That happened because the children of the people who were slave masters, the grandchildren, they had a mentality about Black people, and that Black success and Black wealth was somehow going against the world order as they knew it to be. It had to be destroyed because it wasn't right to begin with. And that if a Black man or a Black woman had money, somehow or some way, that was taking away from a white person. So let's all sit with that a second. In fact, let's go back to the group, the group setting, so I can see your lovely faces. So think about that for a second. So we got slavery where Black people were owned by white people. We have the Tulsa massacre where white people were resentful of Black success. We have the civil rights movement, which is 50 years after the Tulsa, where dogs and water hoses are sticked on Black people who are just fighting to have equal rights. So anybody want to throw out any contemporary things that connect to those things? This is safe space, guys. You can say whatever you want. Nobody's going to think poorly
And
of you.
sometimes you let the same person talk, but you don't have to. So I'm sure you have thoughts, you may have questions and comments.
Yes, Melissa, Confederate statues being taken down. But think about the people who really hate that Confederate statues are being taken down, right? I mean, didn't we just have a congresswoman just yesterday or this week make the argument that, you know, if we have what did she say? If we have statues of Hitler and Satan up, that's a good thing, because then I can teach my kids about Hitler and Satan. Yes, Catherine, Black Lives Matters versus All Lives Matters, right? What's that conversation really about?
Yeah.
Personally, if you ask me, it don't matter how far we come, how many obstacles we overturn, there's still going to be racism.
Can I have something to drink?
Right, exactly.
We're never going to be
say something?
considered
Oh, I'm sorry.
an equal to the Caucasian race because they forced us into that slavery. So they think that we are in that slave mind when we are very actually intelligent people.
Exactly. Catherine, you were about to say something?
Oh, I was just gonna, that just really amazes me and frustrates me so much, because it's, I guess my own understanding of that is that I think for certain people, they feel like anytime it's like Black Lives Matter doesn't put a white person as primary. And so when they say, well, but all lives matter, they're just, it's very, very hard to have that conversation in a way that people, because of course all lives matter. They just don't get that that's the reason for the movement is because Black Lives Matter as well and haven't been treated the same. So anyway, that's just a debate that I think is still going on. That is very frustrating to me.
And I agree with Catherine. Like, yes, all lives do matter, but it's not the white people who are jeopardized right now. It's people, and it's not just Black people. It's Black people, it's Hispanic, it's Muslim. Anybody of color is being targeted just because of the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm. And so can we all, you all
Michelle, I
see now?
think, Ashley, were you trying to say something? It's so
Well,
hard on this
Melissa-
format. I hate this.
No, you're okay. Melissa hit on it. I was going to say it becomes more of losing a power. And that's how they interpret it, that you don't want to back it because you feel like you are not you have no more power. So when we say all lives, it's, oh, well, I'm no longer I have no power. So you're losing your right. So then it goes back to what Michelle has said, when you've asked on, how does it feel to not have freedom? We lose that freedom, for 2 years, you feel like you're losing freedom because you're saying all lives versus putting someone before.
And first of all, Deidre, thank you because I can't, in my talking and looking around, I can't always see who's unmuting to talk.
That's my role to roll around.
Thank you. And I apologize if I don't always see you all when you do that. I'm not trying to ignore anybody. I just, but
I'm wondering, Matrika put herself on the screen. Do you have something to say, Matrika?
No.
Okay. Yes, I was going to say, that's why to me, Juneteenth is something that I want you all to sort of get in the habit of mentally making those connections. Like even when you see something that unfolds today, Ashley, you just expressed it. Melissa, you just said it in the chat. What we're all talking about, that it all links to the same thing. It's almost as if, we've all heard the pie analogy. We think that as a country, that it's just one pie. People talk about the melting pot. No, it's a pie. Now, in my philosophy, it's not a pie, it's unlimited pies coming out of God's cosmic oven, but that's me. A lot of people think of it as one pie, and if you get a slice of pie, that's less pie for me. And so when you look at whether you go forward or backwards, it always goes in the same direction of what is it that we have a problem with when it comes to Black people, and what is the reaction to it that dominant society has. So, you have slavery, which is about ownership. So you've set up, so the framing of the country has set up a situation.
I can't hear you, Miss Michelle.
Can you not hear me?
Hear you fine.
Okay. So, where Blacks are chattel, then you go from chattel to, well, they're no longer chattel, but come on. You think it went that quickly to, we no longer think of these people as anything but property? Again, another reason why 2.5 years between that Texans had to learn. There was a slide that I had, and we don't have to go back to it, where historians have investigated, like, why did it take 2.5 years? Now, I think in some respects, there's the obvious, that we didn't have Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime can get you damn near anything in 2 days. I have literally had a couch delivered in 2 days. But in the 1800s, there was no Amazon Prime. There was no CNN. There was no text alerts. So people physically had to get from place to place to share information. So there's that. But even that didn't take 2.5 years, right? So some speculate it's because folks wanted the slave owners to have the opportunity to get one last free crop.
And I think Texas is always kind of like, you're not telling us what to do. You're not the boss of us. So they were pushing back.
Yeah.
Part of it was the length of the news scale, but a lot was them pushing back. Absolutely.
And you know, just as a side note, I was a newspaper reporter in Austin, Texas, when I was in my 20s. And I remember when my boyfriend at the time and I drove from, because I used to live in Louisville in my 20s as a newspaper reporter, and we drove to my new job in Austin. And when we got to the state line, he's like, "We're here in Texas." I was like, "Honey, we still have 5 more hours to drive," because that's how big a state Texas is. So if it was a 5-hour drive from the border of Texas to Austin, then I can only imagine somebody on a horse getting to Galveston, which is at the bottom of the state. And that's no excuse. I'm not saying that that's an excuse. I'm just saying that, you know, as we're thinking about all these things, we have to think about the worst case scenario, but we also need to think about the realities of the time. And somebody just said something here that's so true. The slave owners didn't want to miss out on money and labor. Again, fear of losing and blacks gaining, which again gets back to the industrial prison complex now, right? Like there is a reason that disproportionately we have Black and brown people in prison. So as we've talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome, here's where it gets a little fun/complicated. How would you think that impacts Juneteenth? Anybody? So if you are talking about and celebrating something that connects to slavery, even though it's a air quotes positive because it's commemorating the end of slavery, but how do you think that might manifest?
Could be a trigger. You know, just bringing back memories of it, what they went through. Like you said, even if you did not necessarily go through it ourselves, it's embedded in us, and just kind of just a triggering effect.
Yes,
which
exactly.
is what post-traumatic is. You know, it's where you relive something that happened to you that was stressful, that was harmful, that was traumatic. So it could ignite that. So something that should be celebratory could actually be a hard day for some people.
Yes, exactly. So I have a question for you because I know, you know, this is about, you know, parenting and tips and tools for how we talk about these things. I'd love to hear from somebody who could tell me how they explained slavery to their child. Like the first conversation you had to have with your child about slavery. Is there anybody who can share that with me? Because full disclosure, I don't have kids.
I have a 13-year-old daughter who is, you know, getting up and to learning everything. And we've had to have that conversation about racism and slavery, you know, and I let her know how they were, like, Black people were stolen from Africa, brought over here to America, and forced to basically build this country. Because that's basically what the slaves did. We built this country. You know, and how we still have to fight for our rights and to be able to do stuff. Like, honestly, I'm scared for my son. I really am. And that's my only son. I mean, granted, he's only 4, but I have fear for him. I've seen an officer on a video cuffing a 6-year-old child for throwing a tantrum at school. Like, this is what society and our world has come to. Like, even babies ain't safe.
You know, Michelle, that appreciate you bringing up, and I applaud you for disclosing your fears for your son. Actually, that this is actually part of the reason we formed this forum, because we have heard, I've been with UICS almost 9 years, and we hear from parents all the time, their fears and their frustrations about school systems and other systems and how they'll interact with their children when they leave our centers. And sometimes families come back. We're a resource as your kids move on to kindergarten. But part of that is for us to equip families with how to have the conversations with their children, but also how to be an advocate for what's best for your children. You know, personally, I recall with my 15-year-old, the movie 12 Years a Slave coming out, and we watched it. And she was in, I believe, 3rd grade. And she came home from school after having talked about it with a teacher that pretty much blasted my parenting skills on why would I let her watch that. And so, but reason I made her watch it is because I remember watching Roots at almost that same age. And so, you know, if you're not watched Roots for the younger parents, you need to go back and watch it, because it's timeless history. It's hard to watch, but my mother had me watch Roots, and that's why I felt like 12 Years a Slave was, you know, that contemporary, you know, it's difficult, it's painful, but we have children watch all kinds of things that they shouldn't watch. Why we wouldn't think it's important for them to see violence in the context of our history? It's the unfortunate realness of who we are as a nation. I do think that our preschoolers are a little young for something like that, but it doesn't mean that they don't see and hear. You know, when George Floyd died and this whole country was in complete unrest, I mean, my grandchildren were 3 and 7 at the time, and they were protesting with us. And they like, children know, they're seeing and hearing lots of things. And if you don't teach them yourself, they're going to learn it somewhere. And so do you want them to learn, you know, through a lens that makes sense, or do you want them to hear it on the playground from a peer that doesn't tell the story in the way you might want them to hear it as a parent?
Before, well, Latrice, you were about to say something. I wanted to say something, but you go right ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I watched Glory as a child, 8th grade. It was a requirement of our 8th grade class, history class, was to watch that. But I also watched it with my kids. I watched documentary with my kids because I want to be there to answer their questions, most importantly.
Exactly.
And not to compound on the negative of it all, but to show this is what happened and this is where we are, and not to hone in on the violence or the negativity that did happen to our ancestors, but the positive things, even with the massacre in Tulsa. Look at what they built. They built schools, financial systems. They built roads. They built daycares. They worked together. So look at what they did. Yes, it's gone. We know why it's gone, but look at who we are and where we came from and what we continue to do out of it. So I just like to be there to answer their questions. And just like any mother, you know, it's going to hurt. And my daughter's very sensitive. She feels it. And I want to be there with her. I don't want her to be out there and learn the hatred of it all, but to know we got to love people past their hatred and show them how to treat us, and not, I just want to be there to support her, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
No, that makes perfect sense. You know, when I was a kid, I went to, it doesn't exist anymore, but there was a grade school called St. Francis Xavier. And it was on Truce. If you've probably seen the church, the Big Fish Church. And even in the 70s, it was a racially diverse school, white, Black, Latinos, before I even knew, you know. And Roots came on the air, miniseries, and I didn't want to watch it because I looked at it as history. And my mother, in her finest mothering moment, said, "You're gonna watch that. You're gonna sit down and you're gonna watch every single minute of that, because you need to know about slavery. You may go to a mostly white school where they may not teach you this stuff, but you're gonna learn." And I do think that's kind of why I'm talking about Juneteenth, right? Because What you just said, Latrice, is exact to me. Again, non-parent here, but I've been parented and I work in schools and I am fake aunt to a lot of kids. And as an honorary aunt to kids, I am just a believer that it's not my job to tell you that Santa Claus isn't real, but it's my job to help you work through the mythology of Santa Claus once you find out. And that's
whoa, hold on. What'd you say?
My bad. I hope the kids aren't around. I hope you don't have any kids around who heard that.
I learned that in church. And I didn't know before. And our pastor got up there and said, ain't no Santa and there ain't no Claus. Ain't nobody but your mama and pa. And I looked at my mom and dad like, what? Oh, they were mad. They were like, we wasn't ready to say. Never forget that.
Right. But again, we all, because it's all connected. We all grow up with a certain mythology to everything, whether it's Santa Claus or the mythology of Martin Luther King Jr., okay? Where people only pass on the things about King that work for them. Like if I hear one more racist and or conservative say, King was about the content of your character. I'm like, if that's the only thing you know of what Martin Luther King Jr. said, you have not studied Martin Luther King Jr. Okay? But that's a mythology. And so what I'm saying when I say about what conversations are you having with your kids about slavery, I asked that question and I hope you all think about it even past this, because your kids are all going to hear about slavery at some point. Like there's no 18-year-old American walking around who hasn't heard about slavery, correct? So it's a matter of what is your kid going to hear about slavery? What are they going to be told? And then back to what you said, Latrice, what's the context that you're going to teach them? What are you going to teach them about Juneteenth? What are you going to teach them about how Black people, generation after generation, dealt with post-slavery existence in America, whether you were born in 1868, whether you were born in 1968, whether you were born in 2008. And
Michelle,
yes.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I don't know if there's a couple really great comments in the chat. Roberto, I don't know if you want to build upon what you were saying about teaching children about equity.
Yes, Roberto, I believe you can teach the principle of equity, fairness, righteousness in its basic form to children. This will create a foundation that will shape, sorry, my thing just went up. That will shape their thinking when they confront discrimination and inequalities in later years. And let's just be honest, not necessarily as much later years as you would want them to, right? I mean, you know, your kids, you may think that your kid doesn't need to know about something till they're a freshman in high school, and the school they go to may teach them that lesson when they're in the 6th grade. There's a study that I read once that said that the average Black kid starts hearing about race at the age of 4, whereas the average white kid doesn't hear about race or have a conversation with their parents about race until they're 14.
Roberto, did you want to?
I've been teaching my children. I'm sorry, Ms. D.
Yeah,
I'll
I was
go
trying
next.
to. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Michelle. Okay, I'll go ahead and share. I think for me, it's like when you think of math, like the subject of math, like math is like a knowledge that's built upon like foundations, right? In order for you to be able to start dividing and multiplying and get to like algebra or calculus. Like, you have to understand the basic principle of addition. I think the same applies to concepts just of inequalities and racism that our children are going to experience. How do we build them at this age? We're giving them a foundation, so when they experience it later on or they come across it, they're not like, I'm not sure how to really process all this information that is dealt to me. I think at this age in preschool and early child education, the principle of fairness and sharing, I think those are principles that are going to build them a strong foundation for our children when they encounter these things, because in those moments, I feel like they would know exactly, like, this goes against, what I've been taught all along. And I know how to solve this problem, and it's not stressing me out because I've come across situations like this that are stressful. So I think that's something that we should be mindful of in teaching children.
I love that. That's so true. I mean, I do think it's about the foundation and building on the foundation. Then you can, and we're all a part of that. Let's see, Vicky, I read something that said if Black children can experience slavery.
I can't hear you, Miss Michelle. I don't know why my phone keeps doing this.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. I hear you now.
Okay. I read something that said if Black children can experience slavery, white children can be taught about slavery. And I mean, again, at what point do you want to be the parent where you're leaving it all up to everybody else, regardless of your race? Because that's the whole thing. It's the argument that people make about sex education. Your kids are going to learn about it anyway. Who do you want to teach them?
I've been teaching my kids about slavery and sex. Because you got to start young. You really have to start young with these kids. And I said, I have a son, I've got daughters, but I think I talk a lot with my daughters because, they've got a double whammy. You're a female and you're Black. And it's hard for Black females to get ahead because they think that they're stupid or they don't meet with the men's thing, they're not up there with men. So I teach my children, like, you can do anything you want as long as you put your mind to it. Don't let nobody ever steer you wrong.
So as we're going to the last few minutes of the session, there's the other aspect of all of this I want you to sort of think about in terms of how you learn about Juneteenth and what you pass on to your children is, it's important to make sure that you're giving your kids context and that you know the context. Because if you don't, what we in a society have done is we have dumbed things down to the lowest common denominator and things that have become the most pleasant way of hearing about it. So what we don't want Juneteenth, for example, to turn into, in a few years, because all these corporations have decided to celebrate Juneteenth, we don't want it to become just another holiday where people sell cars. I don't know about you, but pretty much when you turn on the TV set, every holiday has become an opportunity for people to sell cars. Labor Day weekend car sale, Memorial Day weekend car sale. I mean, I think the first time I saw a Martin Luther King Jr. car sale, I felt like there was like a jolt to my heart. Like, oh God, no, really. But we're gonna get there. I'm just letting y'all know, that if we don't put a claim and a frame around Juneteenth, it's gonna be just a June holiday that's a stopping point between Memorial Day and 4th of July weekend.
Yeah, I want us to be sure we don't miss out on Rhonda. I think she has Rhonda, are you still on here? We have a little bit of information about some of the local festivities.
Yes.
I think that one of the things that you said that was the most profound yes, as Black people, we gather and we celebrate, but you don't want to miss that opportunity to share the history, because like celebrating and gathering is all wonderful, but if it's in the vein of never even talking about, well, what is June 19th, Juneteenth? Like it isn't too young. Like if you're gathering with your children, like there are simple ways to talk about those concepts of free versus slave and emancipate, freedom. Like it's a concept somewhat that children can grasp in their own minds and on their own levels. And I would say to our parents that, I was just going to say, I would say to our parents, if you're wondering how to have the conversation, or if your child asks a question that you don't know how to answer, ask your child's teacher, ask the center director, ask the family advocate, and we will do our best to help you have the conversation. Books, movies, things of that nature, drawings, those are great ways to draw out that conversation with children. Yeah.
And that was all I was going to say, what you just said, Deidre, but I'm glad you said it because you had more details to offer. You can't tell half the story when you're talking about Juneteenth. Unfortunately, you can't just talk about the celebration without talking about what precedes the celebration. So Rhonda, you had some things to share with us?
If not, I got one more suggestion that could possibly help us get our awareness up.
What I will share is on June 12th, UICS will be participating in the Juneteenth parade. You will be getting more information about that. We'll send that out to those of you that are not employed or a parent, and make sure that you're able to engage with us as well. It's always a really fun time to listen to all the drill teams and bands and walk safely. This year will be real interesting. And then on the 19th, there are celebrations on both sides of the state lines. I know those that are in Kansas don't want to compete with what's going on 18th and Vine, but also recognizing some of the people over in Prairie Village, Leawood area, they might not travel over to a festival at 18th and Vine. So you can still have more than one gathering. Just, hey, go to, looks like Mariah, you want to speak to the resources in the chat? And we'll also send a follow-up email out to our families.
I got one more suggestion. Oh, go ahead, baby.
I was just going to say, I sent that flyer for the Juneteenth parade and how we're planning to participate. And then we have a list of resources that we can email everyone if that is advisable.
There's Rhonda. You're probably doing a couple things.
I'm sorry. I was doing a couple of things. I'm sorry. I can't comment on the parade and the festival that we are participating in this year, the Juneteenth festival, and we're wanting to include families like we've always done before, and staff. The parade is June 12th, and we will send out more information about the staging and where we're going to meet, and if you want to carpool and anything like that with someone else. And then the festival, we are going to have a vendor booth at the festival, which is the following Saturday, which is June 19th. And we'll have some interactive things for families to do at our booth as well. There will be a sign-up sheet at the front desk of each center for families that want to participate, so that we can get a number or a count of how many families or how many participants we will have. So.
Well, as I said, I want pictures.
I want to say one thing, because this helped us a lot when I was growing up. So how y'all are talking about the Juneteenth and, celebrating it and everything. In my church growing up, every February, which, is Black History Month, we really celebrated it with soul dinners and plays and pretending like we were like, I think one year I was Rosa Parks and I had to write a thing and read it in church. And I think as a community, if we got together and did that, it would possibly help, bring us all together and really get a true insight on Black History Month and what it means to us. So like in February, if we could all gather like every weekend or, you know, do something that possibly could help bring our community together and them know who our heritage.
In a non-COVID world, we do lots of stuff. We always have Kansas City Friends of Alvin Ailey come, but we haven't been able to gather. This is about as good as it's gotten for a little over a year now. So hang on with us. And even if your children are going on to kindergarten, be sure you keep yourself connected to our communications so you do know about events and activities that we do that help us try to lift up not just Black history and Juneteenth, but just the positive representation of all of our children. I'm super excited about the self-portraits that the St. Mark students have that are going with them as a part of their graduation activity.
Aww.
Some of it is just the simplicity of like helping kids normalize this conversation about different skin tones and hues. And as Breanne Peg shared on one of the other times that we were together, you know, art medium is just a really, really great kind of less confrontational way to bring out some of these discussions with children, because they see and they recognize and they have questions. And Matrika had typed in the chat earlier, you know, her 10-year-old asking her, why would somebody not like me just because of the color of my skin? You want to be prepared as a parent, because that's a gut wrench. Like when your kids come with these big whopper questions, as I call them, like you're like, what do I do with this? How do I handle that? You know, first you want to kind of crawl up and not deal with it at all, but you can't, because you are the best teacher they have as parents. And so as our staff work with your children, it's just, we're just the surrogate parent and grandparent while you're at work. And so, you know, more to come on additional resources on all these things.
And it's so important. I mean, it is just, I cannot even emphasize how important it is to not take for granted even a seemingly small holiday like Juneteenth, right? Because in my mind, everything is a learning lesson. Everything is something that you can use as your springboard to talk about something with your children. And, you know, last month I talked about, you know, the media. I talked about, I should say, fictional media and how that's your spring point to talking about things. But a holiday is a really good way to do it. You know, from the resources that you get from this, from Googling, there are people out there who are really using this opportunity to have these conversations with their children. And I think it is as important, and I hope that people get this, that we have a tendency to act like it's just Black parents who need to discuss Juneteenth with their kids. We all need to discuss everything with all of our kids. It's about teaching your kids equity and the value of, you know, we really believe in a society of all lives matter, like the real all lives matter, then we're always learning and we're always passing on what we learn to other people. We just have a couple of minutes. Any comments before we say goodbye?
Well, I appreciate everybody sticking with us. This format, you know, one of these days it'll change, and then we'll just have to tell Michelle, get to Kansas City to come see us again.
I guess. I know you got to kick me to the road already. I can feel it with all these vaccines. And you know what? I look forward to the day when we can all get together. You know, I would have loved, trust me, I would have personally have loved to be right there. And because I'm much funnier in person than I am.
Well, let's give it up for Michelle. Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, and for those that didn't know a whole lot about Juneteenth, and for bringing it in your way that really helped to bring it all together, tying in so many different things and so many different aspects. There's still so many seeds of slavery that continue to exist in our communities. And if we don't do our part to ensure that we are a part of the positive change we want to see in our world, we'll continue to see it. And so this was just one small contribution to that journey.
Yes.
Rebecca or Mary?
I read a quote the other day that said we need to learn about what happened and what didn't happen, because only then can we realize the possibilities. And I think it was written by the woman that wrote the book that I was telling you about Juneteenth. So I think historical context is so important, because that's how we keep holidays from becoming car sales or washing machine sales or whatever. So
yes,
so true. These conversations are open to anyone, so feel free when you see announcements about next month's conversation that you feel free to share within your network. And until then, have a great Memorial Day. Remember, it's a holiday to remember. And, and there is some context to it. If you don't know what Memorial Day is all about, then go look that one up too.
Sales, there's tons of Memorial Day.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yes.
Well, thank you all
Take
for
good
being
care, everybody.
so lovely, and wave to my precious Kansas City for me, okay?
All right. We'll see you soon.
All righty.
Take care, everyone.